So think about this for a second. You break your arm, right, and you go to the hospital,
Right, yeah.
and an X-ray shows the crack. The doctor points right to this jagged white line on the screen, and then they fix it.
Yeah.
I mean, we expect medical diagnoses to be super precise.
Absolutely. You want to see exactly what's wrong.
Exactly. But what happens when the diagnostic machine itself is, well, what if it's calibrated to only see the bones of a very specific demographic?
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Suddenly you have people walking around with broken arms, and the machine just prints out a totally blank page.
Which is a terrifying prospect, honestly.
Right. The doctor looks at the blank page, looks at the patient who is in obvious pain, and just concludes that there is nothing wrong with them.
Yeah, and when the tools we rely on to see a problem are fundamentally biased in what they're actually designed to look for, I mean, the people who don't fit that original template are just rendered invisible.
And for over a decade, according to our sources today, that is exactly what has been happening in our school systems regarding neurodivergence. Welcome to the Deep Dive. We are taking the stack of sources you provided about K-12 mental health, and we're specifically focusing on the autism equity gap in the state of Georgia, and a really fascinating program called MentalSpace School. We're going to pull out all the most vital insights for you today.
Our mission today is to look at the actual mechanics of this failure. We want to understand how these outdated, really rigidly calibrated perceptions of autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, are leaving specific groups of students behind. And, how a completely different approach based on targeted, culturally competent care is basically changing the landscape entirely.
Okay, let's unpack this. To understand why the machine is missing so many students, we first have to understand what we are actually supposed to be looking at, right?
Yeah, the baseline.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The source material emphasizes a massive, fundamental shift in definition. We really have to stop looking at ASD as a disease to be cured, or like a checklist of deficits.
Yeah.
And we need to start recognizing it as a neurodevelopmental difference.
And that distinction changes the entire objective of the intervention. I mean, a disease model focuses on eradication.
Right.
It basically asks, well, how do we make the student stop acting this way so they appear typical?
Only fill in.
Exactly. But a neurodevelopmental model asks, how is this student's brain processing the world, and how do we adjust their environment so they can actually thrive? It moves the burden of change completely off the student and puts it onto the system.
Let's talk about how that processing actually feels for the student, because the sources bring up sensory sensitivities, and I think this is just wildly misunderstood by most people.
Oh, definitely.
We often hear about kids being, sensitive to sound, but it's so much deeper than just disliking loud noises. I mean, think of the sensory input of a classroom as a radio. For a neurotypical student, the volume dial works perfectly fine. They can tune out the hum of the fluorescent lights or the scraping of chairs, the texture of their uniform.
Yeah, background noise.
Right. But for a student with ASD, that volume dial is broken and it's just stuck at maximum. Every single input is blaring at full volume all at the same time.
What's fascinating here is how that internal sensory chaos manifests externally, specifically in social communication.
How so?
Well, when a student's nervous system is completely overwhelmed by that broken radio dial you mentioned, their ability to navigate complex, nuanced social interactions is severely compromised.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah. The sources show that ASD frequently presents as differences in things like making eye contact, interpreting sarcasm, or picking up on really subtle shifts in tone.
Which, makes perfect sense when you think about it. If you are using literally all your cognitive energy just to tolerate the physical pain of a loud, brightly lit room, you aren't going to catch the subtle, sarcastic joke your teacher just made.
No, not at all.
You're going to take it entirely literally.
And you probably aren't going to look them in the eye while you do it either. But observers, teachers, administrators, even parents, they rarely see that internal sensory overwhelm.
They just see the reaction.
Exactly. They only see the external behavior. And because they're applying a neurotypical framework to a neurodivergent reality, they aggressively mislabel the child.
Wow.
Yeah. The student who takes a sarcastic command literally is labeled defiant. The student who shuts down from sensory overload is labeled lazy, or maybe just shy.
Or quirky.
Right. And the student who avoids eye contact just to regulate their nervous system is called rude.
That is so rough. And if we follow that thread, it leads us directly to the core tension in the materials you shared with us. If all these signs are hiding right in plain sight, it makes me wonder who the system is actually designed to catch and who is slipping through the cracks. This is what the sources call the equity gap, right?
It is a profound, highly measurable gap The sources are definitive that this is a deeply entrenched systemic issue, and they note it has been documented in Georgia for well over a decade.
Over a decade. Wait, are these signs being missed just because educators aren't paying attention, or are we looking at a much deeper systemic issue where unconscious bias plays a role? Because special education is a massive field.
It is, yeah.
I mean, teachers undergo years of specialized training. We have school psychologists and counselors. How is a systemic failure of this magnitude still happening in 2026? Are educators just completely missing the curriculum on this?
Well, the professionals are highly trained, absolutely, but they are often trained on that broken X-ray machine we talked about earlier.
Ah, right.
Historically, the clinical profile for autism was based almost entirely on observations of young white boys.
Oh, wow.
So the training, the checklists they use, and even the unconscious expectations of educators are heavily skewed toward that one really specific presentation.
Meaning if you don't look like that historical profile, the system literally doesn't know how to see your neurodivergence.
Precisely. And the sources explicitly name who pays the price for that blind spot. Girls, Black children, and bilingual learners are routinely underreferred for evaluations.
Let's paint a picture of what this actually looks like in a classroom to see the mechanics of that bias in action. Because the sources give us some good context.
Yeah, let's do it.
Imagine a bilingual student, let's call her Maria, and she's working on a loud, chaotic group project. Her sensory dial is stuck at maximum.
Completely overwhelmed.
Yes. To cope, she stops participating, looks down at her desk, and refuses to make eye contact with the teacher who comes over to check on her.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you can see how cultural context totally collides with an outdated diagnostic lens here.
Right.
A teacher looking through a traditional, biased framework sees Maria looking away and writes down defiant. Or maybe assumes she simply lacks English language comprehension.
Because they aren't seeing the sensory overload.
Exactly. But a culturally competent professional understands that in many Latin American cultures, averting your gaze from an authority figure is actually a sign of respect, not defiance.
So the traditional system sees a language barrier and a behavioral problem. It completely misses that Maria is actually experiencing intense auditory overwhelm and is using a culturally appropriate mechanism to try and self-regulate.
Spot on. And we see this exact same misinterpretation across other marginalized groups, too. For a Black child, that same sensory-driven shutdown is tragically often viewed through a lens of implicit bias.
Which, the sources point out, leads to really different outcomes.
Very different. It often leads to harsh disciplinary action and suspension rather than a clinical referral.
That's heartbreaking.
And for girls, who are often socialized to heavily mask their discomfort and just conform, their struggles are totally internalized. They are praised for being quiet, the good student, while they are silently suffering complete nervous system burnout.
The functional consequence of all this is lost time. The sources stress that these specific groups of students end up being diagnosed years later than their white male peers, if they get diagnosed at all.
And time is arguably the most critical variable in neurodevelopment. I mean, the brain is incredibly plastic in early childhood.
Right, the early intervention windows.
Exactly. When we miss these students for years, they lose the window for early foundational interventions. Instead of learning how to advocate for their sensory needs or developing healthy coping mechanisms, their brains are basically marinating in chronic stress.
Yeah.
They spend years believing they are broken, bad, or stupid simply because their environment is hostile to their neurology.
So how do we fundamentally change the environment then? If expecting families to just navigate the labyrinth of traditional health care while fighting school administrations isn't working, what is the alternative?
The alternative is bringing the expertise directly to the student, utilizing professionals who possess the exact cultural context the traditional system completely lacks.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The sources you provided map out a concrete, functioning solution operating in Georgia right now. It's called MentalSpace School.
Yeah.
And it is a K-12 mental health ecosystem embedded directly into the school environment.
Ecosystem is definitely the accurate term there,
Okay.
because it moves far beyond the outdated model of, a single school counselor trying to manage the emotional weight of 500 kids.
Oh yeah, it is a massive infrastructural shift. They deploy dedicated therapist teams to specific schools. They run same-day teletherapy.
Which is huge.
Huge. They handle acute issues like crisis intervention, suicide, and violence prevention. They even provide wellness support for the school staff and extend out to family counseling. But the absolute anchor of MentalSpace School, and really the direct answer to that 10-year equity gap we discussed, is their mechanism for cultural competence.
Yeah, MentalSpace operates on a strict neurodiversity-affirming model, and they execute it by deliberately utilizing licensed, diverse therapists who actually reflect the student population.
Let's break down why that matters clinically. Because, cultural competence can sometimes sound like just a corporate buzzword.
It really can.
But the sources show that in a diagnostic setting, it is a functional tool.
It changes the entire outcome of an evaluation. Let's go back to our example of Maria.
Okay.
When a diverse, culturally competent therapist sits down to evaluate her, they aren't thrown off by the cultural nuances of eye contact. They understand the colloquialisms of her language.
Because they share that background.
Right. Because the cultural barrier is removed, the therapist can clearly see the underlying neurology. They can separate the stress of language acquisition from a genuine neurodevelopmental difference in social communication.
They see the actual student. Not a stereotype, not a behavioral issue, but a child trying to function in an overwhelming environment.
Exactly.
And because these are licensed clinicians, once they accurately identify the autism spectrum disorder, the sources note they can immediately pivot into evidence-based care.
And the care is highly targeted. One of the primary interventions they use is cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, specifically to address co-occurring anxiety.
I want to explore that connection because it might not be immediately obvious to everyone why anxiety is the primary target there. But if you think back to our broken radio dial analogy, it becomes crystal clear.
Oh, absolutely.
If you spend 8 hours a day in a building that physically overloads your senses, and you are constantly disciplined because people misinterpret your reactions, your baseline state is just going to be panic.
Your body is essentially in a perpetual state of fight or flight.
Yeah.
What CBT does in this context is give the student tangible cognitive tools to recognize when their nervous system is ramping up. It helps them process the sheer anxiety of navigating a neurotypical world. But crucially, MentalSpace doesn't just treat the student's reaction, they treat the environment.
Right. Because alongside the CBT, they work on school-based accommodations, they educate the teachers, they work with the family. They basically turn down the volume on that radio dial by changing the lighting, maybe allowing noise-canceling headphones, or building structured predictability into the student's day.
But all of these brilliant clinical interventions are basically useless if a family can't access them. And the logistics of healthcare are usually where great ideas just go to die.
Yeah, the traditional route is a total nightmare. A teacher flags an issue, the parent spends weeks calling numbers on the back of their insurance card, they get put on a 6-month wait list for a specialist.
If they're lucky.
Right. And by the time they finally get in, the student has failed 3 classes and is completely disengaged.
MentalSpace dismantles that barrier entirely through same-day intake.
Same day. That's incredible.
It really is. If a student reaches a breaking point on a Tuesday morning or a teacher notices a severe shift in behavior, the intake process begins that day. The therapeutic relationship is initiated before the crisis can compound.
And then there's the financial mechanism, which is arguably the most impressive part of their whole model in the sources. For students on Medicaid, the cost of this embedded specialized care is $0.
Which is revolutionary for the most economically vulnerable families in the state, who, by the way, are often the ones hit hardest by that equity gap we were talking about.
Absolutely. And for families with private insurance, they haven't just partnered with 1 or 2 boutique providers. The sources list an absolute blanket of the market. They take Blue Cross, Blue Shield, Cigna, Aetna, United Healthcare, Humana, Peach State, CareSource, and AmeriGroup.
That's basically everyone.
Pretty much. They have engineered the logistics so that neither transportation, because it all happens at school, nor out-of-network costs prevent a child from getting help.
We also have to acknowledge the reality of why school districts are suddenly highly motivated to adopt this kind of comprehensive infrastructure.
Oh yeah, the source mentions House Bill 268 in Georgia, which has a pretty strict compliance deadline of July 2026.
And this represents a massive paradigm shift. Legislation like HB 268 is society finally acknowledging that schools can no longer treat mental health as just an extracurricular luxury.
It's a mandate.
It is a mandate to integrate care. Programs like MentalSpace provide the exact HIPAA and FERPA-compliant framework that districts need to meet that mandate without having to build a clinical infrastructure from scratch.
It forces the issue. But the proof that this model actually works isn't in the compliance codes, it's in the data. When you stop misdiagnosing kids, when you provide culturally responsive therapists, and when you remove the financial and logistical barriers, the outcomes are staggering.
The numbers in the source material are a direct reflection of removing that chronic stress we talked about earlier.
We're looking at an 89% improvement in attendance for these students.
Which makes sense. When the school building transforms from a site of sensory trauma and constant behavioral discipline into an environment where a student actually feels seen and accommodated, truancy evaporates. They actually feel safe enough to walk through the doors.
And the defining statistic here, a 92% reduction in anxiety.
Think about the magnitude of that number, 92%. That is the direct result of combining cognitive tools like CBT with actual environmental accommodations. You stop forcing the student to mask their neurodivergence and the panic just dissipates.
It also completely changes the dynamic at home. It resulted in an 85% family satisfaction rate.
That's huge.
Yeah. Parents who have spent years fighting a system that labeled their child defiant are finally getting a roadmap to support them.
So what does this all mean? If we synthesize everything from the sources today, it really paints a clear picture.
Yeah.
The equity gap in autism diagnosis isn't an accident.
No, not at all.
It is the predictable result of a diagnostic machine calibrated to a very narrow, outdated profile. But by fundamentally redefining neurodivergence and changing the architecture of how care is actually delivered, we can fix it.
Embedding diverse, culturally competent clinicians directly into schools isn't just a progressive theory. It is a functioning, evidence-based mechanism that captures the Black, bilingual, and female students who have been falling through the cracks for over a decade. It moves the burden of adaptation off the vulnerable child and forces the system to accommodate them.
And for listeners who want to dive deeper into the mechanics of this model or explore how it might apply to your own local districts, the sources provided direct contact avenues. You can review their framework at mentalspaceschool.com or reach out to their team at mentalspaceschool@cddretherapy.com.
So what does this all mean? I mean, really, at the end of the day.
Well, this raises an important question. We've seen that bringing culturally competent, frictionless mental health care into a single environment, the school, can drop student anxiety by 92% and practically eliminate truancy. If simply changing the environment to fit the neurology of the individual can yield those kinds of results, what other massive, seemingly unsolvable societal crises are we fundamentally misunderstanding? Are we constantly trying to fix the individual when we should be dismantling and rebuilding the room they are forced to stand in?
Wow. That is exactly the lens we need to be looking through moving forward. It changes everything. A massive thank you to everyone listening to this deep dive. Keep examining the systems around you, and we'll catch you next time.